part to ease the situation on the continent, Ukraine now trying to propose their initiatives about the peaceful formula or peace plan. So let's talk about this as part of the ongoing dialogue with allies. The head of the office of the president, Andriy Yermak, discussed with the advisor to the United States President, Jake Sullivan, Ukraine's desire to implement its peace formula as a basis for achieving sustainable peace in Europe. During the conversation, Yermak emphasized the importance of involving as many countries as possible in supporting the Ukrainian peace formula. Earlier, the White House declared its readiness to support Ukraine's diplomatic efforts to finally end the war unleashed by the Kremlin regime. I'll remind you that on November 15th, President Zelensky presented Ukraine's peace formula at the G20 summit. It consists of 10 steps to put an end to Russian aggression, restore peace, and strengthen respect for international law. 10 elements include nuclear safety, food security, energy security, release of all prisoners and deported persons, implementation of the United Nations Charter, and restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, full withdrawal of Russian troops and cessation of hostilities, restoration of justice, countering ecocide, preventing escalation, and ensuring that aggression does not repeat ever. So my question will be about the mechanisms. I mean, what is the mechanism for the participation of third countries in the implementation of President Zelensky's peace formula? Because each of the points will be considered by these countries, these representatives, in one way or another through the prism of their interests. So how to implement the peace plan on Ukraine's terms, but taking into account the interests of third countries, especially with regard to the main issue, it's a peace negotiations with Russia, on which Ukraine has its own unshakable position today. So what do you think? Is it possible to unite the interests of third countries and the position of Ukraine government, of Ukraine society, and of Ukraine president?
I think it's a very worthy endeavor by the government of Ukraine to articulate its position in this matter, which I happen to think is a completely reasonable position. It's unfortunately necessary for Ukraine to do that because of the proliferation of so-called peace proposals from other governments, many of which envision Russian troops remaining in occupied parts of Ukraine, which I think it's only fair to call essentially legitimating or giving some kind of approval to Russia's war of aggression. So I can certainly see why Ukraine has produced its own set of proposals that it is trying to encourage its friends in the world to support, right? To indicate that this is a set of principles that can end this conflict, and not the ones that countries such as, say, China have advocated for, and which some other, as you mentioned, some other BRICS members, such as Brazil, seem to be receptive to, right? To kind of prevent the formation of a sort of alternative pseudo-agreement or pseudo peace position in which Russia is allowed to reap some territorial and military benefits from its war of aggression against Ukraine. I think the question about how widespread the uptake or the agreement to these principles that Ukraine has articulated will be is exactly the right question. In terms of how this is compatible with their self-interest, I think I would argue that it is compatible with their self-interest. So let me give you an example. I live in Canada. So I tell people in Canada who ask me, why does this matter for us? Here in Canada, Ukraine is very far away. We don't have a border with Russia. Leaving aside the fact that Canada actually does have some concerns about the sovereignty of its Arctic territories and threats to them from Russia, I think that most governments should understand or should be able to be convinced that the position that Ukraine is advocating is reasonable and is in their own interest as sovereign states that do not wish to become essentially the victims or the objects of aggression by a handful of countries in the world that enjoy the power that the Russian Federation enjoys, and which it is currently abusing in the most disgraceful and outrageous manner. So I think that I would like to think that with diplomacy and persuasion, a large number of countries can be persuaded to accept Ukraine's principles. If they can't, then what they are saying is that they are indifferent to the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-aggression that Ukraine is standing for. And so even if they don't agree to them, or if they try to propose alternative, as I was saying earlier, pseudo peace proposals like the ones that some actors such as China have tried to present, it's still very valuable that Ukraine is doing this because it is making the stakes clear, and it is compelling everybody in the world to identify themselves, to identify the position that they hold and how they situate their government in relation to these different proposals.